Some of the most important scientists of the Nazi regime. They never appeared on lists of accused persons. Their names are not among the best-known convicts, nor among the officially missing persons being sought. Even so, they continued working, now under new flags, in countries that, not long before, were their direct enemies. There are records of altered files, rewritten political affiliations, and pasts softened by a few typewritten lines. In certain cases, the word Nazi simply disappears from the documents. In its place, another description appears: essential specialist, strategic asset, risk of falling into rival hands. While the public narrative spoke of justice and accountability, another logic was in operation, a silent, pragmatic, uncomfortable logic. The knowledge of these men became more valuable than the questions that were never asked. What happened to them wasn't announced. It didn't make headlines. It wasn't in textbooks. But it left deep marks on science, technology, and the balance of power that shaped the world in the following decades. And the more one investigates this path, the clearer an unsettling feeling becomes. The story you learned is incomplete. Shortly after the German surrender, while the world was still trying to grasp the magnitude of what had happened, something strange began to stir behind the scenes. It wasn't visible to the general public, it didn't appear in the newspapers, and it wasn't part of official speeches. But in military, in corridors, makeshift offices, and the closed rooms of intelligence services, one question began to dominate everything. Where are the brains of the Reich? It wasn't historical curiosity, it was urgency, because the Allies realized very quickly that Germany hadn't been defeated solely by soldiers and tanks. It had been sustained by science, engineering, and advanced research. And that completely changed the game. When the troops advanced through German territory, they found not only destroyed cities, they found secret laboratories, hidden factories, underground tunnels full of documents, prototypes and projects that seemed from another time. Rockets far ahead of anything that existed in the rest of the world, experimental aircraft, advanced chemical research, detailed medical studies, some of them disturbing. And then the first shock occurred. Much of this technology simply did not exist outside of Germany, not in the United States, not in the Soviet Union, not in the United Kingdom. Whoever mastered this knowledge had an immediate advantage in the world that was about to be born. It is at this moment that the logic changes. The war had ended on the battlefield, but a new dispute was beginning, silent and cold. The former allies no longer trusted each other as much. Tension between the United States and the Soviet Union grew day by day. And, in the midst of all this, German scientists became valuable assets. It wasn't just what they had done during the regime that mattered. What mattered most was what they knew, and this created an uncomfortable dilemma: punish everyone, or use some. From then on, a real race against time begins. Special troops receive clear orders to locate scientists before they flee, hide, or are captured by another power. Many try to disappear, change their names, burn documents, blend into the population. Others do the opposite. They surrender voluntarily, not out of remorse, but for survival. They know they are valuable. They know they have something to offer. And they know that this can be the difference between a cell and a laboratory. The interrogations take on a different tone. They are no longer just questions about involvement with the Nazi Party or crimes committed. They are technical conversations, long and full of details. How does this engine work? How far can this rocket go? Was this project close to completion? Gradually it becomes clear that it's not just about justice. It's about power, about the future, about who will lead the next chapter of world history. And here comes the most annoying part. Not all scientists were treated the same way. Some were arrested immediately. Others were separated, classified, evaluated. Informal categories were created, even if no one openly admitted it. disposable scientists, useful scientists, strategic scientists. For many of them, the past begins to be relativized. Participation in the regime becomes political pressure. Direct involvement with the party is treated as a secondary detail. The focus shifts completely. Meanwhile, documents disappear. Records are delayed. Files remain incomplete. What should be transparent becomes confidential. What should be public becomes secret for decades. And all this happens quickly before public opinion realizes what is being decided, because if these choices came to light at that moment, they would be difficult to justify. Perhaps the most disturbing thing is realizing that, even at this early stage, the fate of many scientists was practically sealed, not by courts, not by judges, but by military analysts and intelligence agents sitting at makeshift tables, deciding who deserved punishment and who deserved a second chance. And the criterion was rarely moral. And that's precisely where the story starts to get really uncomfortable, because this silent screening, done hastily and away from the spotlight, wasn't the end of these scientists' story. It was just the beginning of something much and bigger. Something that would change not only their fate, but the balance of power in the entire world. What came after these initial decisions explains why so many names disappeared, and why others reappeared in places where no one expected them. And when you understand how these decisions were made in silence, it becomes impossible not to wonder how far this went, because none of this would have worked without remaining hidden for so long. If this part of the story has already made you look at the end of the war with different eyes, it's worth continuing to follow what comes next. By subscribing and leaving your like, you help this content reach more people who also distrust the official version. And write in the comments what city you are watching from. These stories crossed countries, continents, and now they reach you. The next excerpt reveals where these men were taken and who opened the doors for them. After this silent screening began, the atmosphere changed completely for the German scientists who were still in the country or trying to flee. It was no longer a scene of open chaos, but it wasn't safe either. It was pure uncertainty. Many of them woke up not knowing if that would be the day someone would knock on the door to take them away. And when that knock came, there was almost never a clear explanation. It wasn't a typical arrest with formal charges. It was something colder, more calculated. They were taken to military bases, isolated houses, makeshift buildings, places where there were no signs, no visible records, only questions. And here it's worth pausing, because this detail changes everything. These interrogations didn't follow a single pattern. Some scientists were treated like prisoners of war. Others, curiously, received coffee, cigarettes, time to talk. The way each one was approached already said a lot about what was at stake. It wasn't just about investigating the past. It was about measuring the value of that man, measuring how much he knew, measuring how useful he could be. And this made it clear from the beginning that their fate would not be decided solely by justice. The questions began simply, almost innocently. Academic background, area of expertise, projects developed. But the tone quickly changed. The interrogators wanted technical details, numbers, diagrams, processes. They wanted to understand how far Germany had come and how much further it still had to go. In many cases, the scientists realized that the interrogators themselves did not master the subject, and this created a strange inversion of power. The prisoner was, at the same time, the only source of answers. And that's where the first internal conflict arises for these men. Some try to hide information, fearing what might happen. Others do the opposite. They talk too much. They explain everything, not out of loyalty, but out of survival instinct. Because it becomes clear very quickly that those who cooperate receive different treatment. A better room, less surveillance, more conversation, small privileges that in that context meant everything. Meanwhile, intelligence services begin cross-referencing data. One scientist says one thing, another confirms, a third contradicts. Gradually, a detailed map of German science during the regime is formed. Who led projects? Who merely carried out orders? Who was directly linked to the party? Who feigned distance? This analysis wasn't moral, it was strategic. And that's what makes it all so unsettling. Because in this process, many crimes are relegated to the background. Questionable experiments, dangerous collaborations, silence in the face of abuse. All of this becomes relative depending on the technical value of that man. It's not that these facts are completely ignored. They are recorded, filed away, but put on hold, as if they could be resolved later, or perhaps never. Another point that is rarely discussed is the psychological one. These scientists were under enormous pressure. They had lost the regime that protected them, their status, their prestige. Now they were in the hands of the victors. Every wrong answer could cost them everything. Every right answer could open an unexpected door. And this creates a tense environment where truth, omission, and convenience are constantly intertwined. Meanwhile, the clock was ticking, because the Allies knew they weren't alone in this quest. Every day of delay meant the chance for another country to get there first. For another intelligence service to convince that scientist to cooperate. This urgency explains why many decisions were made too quickly, without in-depth investigation, without public debate, without consensus. At the end of this phase, few scientists still believed that everything would end in court. Most had already understood that they were being evaluated for something different, something that didn't have an official name, but which was becoming increasingly clear between the lines. And it is precisely this feeling that the real game was happening far from the trials that connects everything you've seen so far, because those silent decisions from the beginning were now taking concrete form. And the next step would make it even more evident that for some of these men, the past was beginning to be treated as a negotiable detail. There comes a point when the word judgment begins to circulate more forcefully, and this completely changes the atmosphere. Until then, everything was uncertainty, screening, interrogation, cold calculation. But now something emerges that, at least in theory, should bring justice. And it is precisely here that the story becomes more contradictory, because for some scientists, the path to the courts was quick and inevitable. For others, this path simply never existed. The trials didn't fall from the sky. They were the result of international pressure, political necessity, and above all, public exposure. The world demanded answers. It demanded guilty parties. It demanded to see faces, hear confessions, and apply sentences. And in fact, some scientists directly linked to serious crimes were brought to trial. Doctors involved in human experiments, researchers who crossed any ethical boundary, men whose names were linked to atrocities impossible to ignore. These cases were too clear to be hidden. But even in these trials, something stands out. The way the accusations were constructed. The focus wasn't on the system, nor on science as a tool of the regime. It was on the individual, isolated, as if everything had been the work of a few monsters and not of an entire machine functioning with technical and scientific support. This helped create a more comfortable narrative, easier to swallow, easier to conclude. Meanwhile, many other scientists watched everything from afar. They knew their names were on file. They knew they had collaborated even indirectly. They knew they had a responsibility, and yet they weren't called. They weren't cited. They weren't summoned. This silence was no accident. It was part of the same calculation that had been made from the beginning. Who is worth more in prison, and who is worth more free? Behind the scenes, the logic was simple, though morally disturbing. If the scientist was essential to technological advancement, possessed rare knowledge, or could strengthen a victorious power, their accusations were delayed, fragmented, or simply dismissed. Not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. In that case, the tribunal ceased to be about justice and became about risk. This creates a contrast that's hard to ignore. On one side, public trials, harsh sentences, headlines. On the other, silent agreements, closed doors, confidential files. The official story speaks of accountability. The real story shows selectivity. And the more you pay attention, the more you realize that these two paths walked side by side, but never truly crossed. Another important detail is that many of the scientists on trial were not necessarily the most influential. They were the most exposed, those whose crimes were visible, documented, impossible to deny. Those who worked in strategic areas, far from concentration camps, inside military laboratories, had a dangerous advantage. Their crimes were technical, bureaucratic, diluted in reports and projects, more difficult to explain to the public, easier to relativize. And here's an uncomfortable point. Science became a shield. In many cases, the defense revolved around the idea of following orders, of purely technical work, of scientific neutrality. Arguments that sound absurd today, but which, in that context, worked, especially when those judging also needed that same knowledge for the future. While some scientists listened to harsh sentences, others watched everything in silence, realizing that the worst might already be over, not because they were innocent, but because they had been deemed too useful to be discarded. And this created a strange feeling of survival by technical merit, not by character. This contrast leaves deep marks, because it shows that the trials, although necessary, did not tell the whole story. They only showed what could be shown, and they hid what was still being negotiated. For many scientists, the tribunal was not an end. It was a detour, a path that almost happened, but was avoided at the last moment. And it is precisely this feeling of incomplete justice that connects everything to what came before. That silent screening, those calculated interrogations, now made sense. Trials were not everyone's final destination. They were just one of the options. And for some men, the most dangerous option was not being condemned. It was being considered too valuable to be judged. It is precisely after this feeling of incomplete justice that the story takes a silent turn, one of those that don't appear in textbooks. Because while some scientists were being judged and others observed from a distance, a third path began to open up, discreet, fast, and extremely well organized. A path that didn't go through courts, but through military offices, forms, special authorizations, and decisions made far from any public debate. And if you stop to think about it, it makes perfect sense. If these men were too valuable to be condemned, then someone needed to decide what to do with them. It is in this context that the United States enters the scene in a much more direct way. American officials had already understood something fundamental. It was not enough to prevent these scientists from falling into the hands of the Soviet Union. It was necessary to bring them closer, to control them, to use them. And this was not done haphazardly. On the contrary, there was planning, structure, budget, and top priority. Then came the Operation Paperclip, although that name only became known decades later. The idea was simple on paper, but morally explosive. Select German. Scientists considered strategic and take them to the United States, along with their families, offering them security, work, and a new life. And here's a detail that's almost never clearly stated. For this to work, these people's pasts needed to be adjusted, not completely erased, but softened. Affiliations with the Nazi Party were minimized. Problematic involvements became footnotes. In some cases, documents were rewritten or simply omitted. These scientists didn't arrive in the United States as criminals. They arrived as experts, engineers, researchers, technicians essential to the country's military and technological future. They were installed in bases, research centers, and universities. Many began working almost immediately, helping to develop missiles, aircraft, defense systems, and later space technology. And all this happened while the American public believed that those responsible for the Nazi regime were being punished. It's impossible to ignore the contrast. On one side, speeches about democracy, freedom, and justice. On the other, secret agreements with men who had worked for a brutal dictatorship. But at that moment, the logic was different. The fear of the Soviet Union spoke louder. The need to win the next global dispute justified almost everything, and science became a bargaining chip. For many of these scientists, the change was almost surreal. In just a few months, they went from a devastated country to a new life in American soil. Houses, salaries, stability. Some even felt relief. Others, distrust. They knew they were being watched, evaluated all the time. But they also knew they had escaped the worst. Not out of naivety, but out of usefulness. And here's a point that still generates discomfort today. The American public was not consulted. Congress did not debate openly. Most of these decisions remained restricted to the high-ranking military and intelligence services, because if they were exposed at that time, they would probably cause outrage. So silence was an essential part of the operation. Over time, many of these scientists became fully integrated. Some became respected figures. Others preferred anonymity. Few spoke publicly about their past. And when they did, they chose their words carefully. Always technical, always neutral, always distant from politics. What is most disturbing is realizing that, while some men paid with their lives or years in prison, others gained a second chance in exchange for knowledge. And this difference was not defined by courts, but by strategic interests. That initial screening, those calculated interrogations, now materialized clearly. The question was no longer, "What did you do?" but "What can you offer us?" And it is precisely this logic that leaves a bitter taste. Because looking at this chapter, it becomes clear that the trials did not end the story of the Nazi scientists. They only separated who would be exposed from who would be repurposed. And when you realize this, an uncomfortable question begins to arise. If the United States did this openly behind the scenes, how far were other countries willing to go to avoid being left behind? While the United States was quietly setting up its infrastructure to absorb German scientists, on the other side of the world, nobody was standing around watching. The Soviet Union not only knew what was happening, but also perfectly understood the risk of falling behind. And here, it's important to make something clear. Without mincing words, the Soviets had no intention of negotiating on the same terms. Where the Americans offered contracts, the Soviets used force. Where there was a promise of stability, there was surveillance. The objective, however, was exactly the same: not to lose German knowledge. As soon as they advanced into territory controlled by them, Soviet agents began locating engineers, technicians, and researchers connected to strategic areas. There wasn't much discussion. In many cases, the scientists were informed that they would be temporarily relocated. Temporarily turned into years. They were put on trains, along with entire families, and sent to isolated regions of the Soviet Union. It wasn't a choice. It was an order, and simply refusing wasn't an option. These scientists didn't arrive as guests. They arrived as resources. They were housed in gated communities, scientific cities created specifically for this type of work. They had housing, food, research facilities, but under strict control. Monitored correspondence, restricted movement, guards, constant reports. The message was simple and clear. You can work, produce, contribute, but never forget that you are being observed. And here's a detail that makes everything even more tense. Many of these scientists knew exactly why they were there. They knew they had escaped trial, not out of mercy, but out of strategic necessity. This created a strange relationship with the Soviet regime. There was no real loyalty. There was survival. They worked because there was no alternative, because they knew that failure could mean severe punishment or disappearance. At the same time, the Soviets were pressing for quick results. They wanted better rockets, more efficient aircraft, advances in weaponry and military technology. The atmosphere was one of constant urgency. There was no room for ethical debates, nor for reflections on the past. The focus was on the future, a future in which the Soviet Union needed to equal or surpass the United States. And German scientists were seen as shortcuts to that goal. The difference compared to the American model is striking here. While in the US, many scientists began to integrate into society, in Soviet Union, they remained isolated. They didn't give interviews. They didn't appear in newspapers. Their names were rarely revealed. Anonymity wasn't a choice. It was the rule. This helped keep everything out of the public eye and made any international questioning difficult. Over the years, some of these scientists were gradually released. Others remained for decades. Some never returned to Germany. Others returned only when they were no longer of strategic interest. And even when they returned, they carried a story they could rarely tell, because admitting what they had done, for whom they had worked, could have consequences anywhere. What's most disturbing is realizing that, just like on the American side, past crimes and collaborations were rarely the deciding factor. The criterion remained usefulness. Whoever knew more stayed longer. Whoever was no longer essential could be discarded. Morality was secondary, always, and this creates an uncomfortable mirror reflecting what you've seen so far. On one side, contracts and new beginnings. On the other, deportations and constant surveillance, different methods, same logic, the same initial screening, the same silent question guiding everything. How much is this man worth to the future? When you put these pieces together, it starts to become clear that Nazi scientists weren't just tried or punished. They were disputed, and this dispute shaped decisions that still resonate today. But what almost no one mentions is that not everyone was captured, absorbed, or controlled. Some simply disappeared from the radar, and that's exactly where the story gets even more unsettling. While the great powers fought over scientists like chess pieces, not everyone got into this game. And this is where the story starts to get even stranger, because in the midst of this organized race between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was a group that simply slipped under the radar. They weren't captured, they weren't recruited, they weren't deported. They vanished. And we're not talking about irrelevant names or secondary figures. Some of these scientists had solid training, direct participation in regime projects, and real technical knowledge. Yet they disappeared from official records with unsettling ease. Many of them understood very early on that they couldn't trust anyone. Not the victors, not their former allies, not promises of protection. They knew that, even if they were useful, they could end up judged, imprisoned, or used until they were no longer needed. So they did what seemed impossible in that scenario. They fled. They changed names, destroyed documents, assumed false identities. In some cases, they relied on support networks that had existed since the end of the war, created precisely to facilitate this kind of silent escape. The most well-known route led to South America, but it wasn't the only one. Countries with weaker oversight, unstable governments, or an interest in foreign technology ended up becoming destinations for these men. Some arrived as technicians, others as professors, others simply as ordinary immigrants. They didn't attract attention, they didn't give interviews, they didn't write books. The rule was simple: the smaller the trail, the better. What is most disturbing is that many managed to reintegrate into civilian life with relative ease. They returned to academia, they worked in private industries, they taught at universities. In some cases, people around them didn't even know about their past. Not because no one was curious, but because there were no accessible records. The past simply wasn't there to be consulted. And when suspicions arose, there was a lack of evidence. There was a lack of documents. There was a lack of political will. Others chose complete isolation. They lived discreetly, far from major centers, avoiding any position that might draw attention. They knew that one mistake, one accusation, one name being recognized, would be enough to bring everything crashing down. This constant fear shaped their lives for decades. It wasn't a temporary escape. It was an entire existence built on silence. And here's a detail that's rarely discussed. Many of these scientists were not hunted with real intensity. Yes, there were lists. Yes, there were searches, but they weren't top priority because at that moment, the focus of the great powers was on securing strategic advantage, not on hunting down everyone involved. If the scientist wasn't essential and wasn't in the spotlight, he simply ceased to be a priority. The world moved on, and these men moved along with it, hidden within it. Over the years, time worked in their favor. Witnesses died, regimes fell, archives were sealed for decades. The context changed, interest waned. What seemed urgent in 1945 became treated as distant past, and this opened the door to something even more uncomfortable, the normalization of forgetting. Some of these scientists died without ever being questioned. Others took their secrets to the grave. In rare cases, stories came to light much later when there were no longer any possible legal consequences, when revealing the truth served only for historical debates, not for real justice. And this leaves a strange, almost unsettling feeling that time ended up acting as an accomplice. The hardest thing to accept is realizing that this disappearance wasn't just the result of individual cunning. It was possible because there were loopholes, because there was convenient silence, because on some level the world accepted moving forward without settling all accounts. And this connects directly to everything that came before. That initial screening, the selective interrogations, the incomplete trials, the secret agreements, all of that created space for some to simply escape. And when you understand this, an inevitable question arises. If so many scientists manage to disappear without a trace, what remains as the real legacy of these choices? Not just in technology or military power, but in something much deeper, the way history has chosen to remember and forget. When you put together everything that has been revealed so far, the feeling that remains is not one of conclusion, but of unease. Because this story was never just about the individual fate of a few scientists. It's about choices made in silence, choices that shaped the world without ever being openly discussed. The science that emerged from that period was not clean, neutral, or disconnected from what came before. It carried marks, difficult decisions, and in many cases concessions that no one likes to confront head-on. Much of the technological advancement in the post-war period, rockets, missiles, aviation, space, research, weaponry, did not arise from nothing. It was accelerated by knowledge originating from a regime responsible for crimes on an industrial scale. And the most uncomfortable point is not this isolated fact, but what was done to make it acceptable. The official narrative preferred to separate science and ideology, as if it were possible to extract knowledge from a context without leaving a trace. As if ideas did not carry history, as if technical choices were not also moral choices. For many, this was treated as a necessary evil. The logic was simple. The world had changed, a new competition was underway, and those who didn't move forward would be left behind. But this justification comes at a price, because when utility becomes more important than responsibility, a dangerous precedent is set. The implicit message is clear. If you are good enough at what you do, your past can be relativized, not erased, but pushed to the back of the drawer. And this wasn't limited to that historical moment. This type of decision creates a pattern. It teaches governments, institutions, and even entire societies to negotiate ethical boundaries when there's something to gain. It teaches that certain crimes can be forgotten if it's convenient. And, over time, this shapes not only policies, but also how history is told, or rather, how it ceases to be told. Another point that is rarely discussed is the impact this has on collective memory. When only some of the guilty parties are exposed and others are protected by silence, an incomplete version of reality is created. The public sees trials, sees convictions, believes that the case has been closed. But it hasn't. Part of it remains open, and this gap fuels distrust, revisionism, and debates that never truly end. There's also the human side to all of this. For the victims, for the survivors, for entire families who never had complete answers, knowing that some of those responsible went on with their lives normally is difficult to accept. It's not about revenge, it's about recognition. About admitting that history wasn't fair to everyone, that not everyone paid the price, and that this didn't happen by chance. At the same time, it's impossible to deny that the modern world was built upon these decisions. Satellites, space exploration, technologies that today seem distant from that era have roots in this complicated past. And this creates an internal conflict for those who try to understand history without oversimplification. It's not comfortable to accept that important advances came accompanied by such profound moral concessions. Perhaps the greatest legacy of this story lies not in the rockets, the laboratories, or the secret archives, but in the question it leaves hanging in the air: how far is a society willing to go to win, advance, or survive? And who decides where that limit lies? Because when these decisions are made far from the public eye, far from debate, and far from official memory, the risk is not only repeating mistakes, it's normalizing them. And that is precisely why looking at this past does not end the matter. On the contrary, it forces us to revisit everything that came before. The silent screening, the selective interrogations, the incomplete trials, the secret agreements, the convenient disappearances. None of this was isolated. It was all part of the same logic. A logic that solved the immediate problem but left a legacy that still weighs heavily. And perhaps the most difficult question is not what happened to the Nazi scientists after the war, but what these choices say about who decided their fate. After all this, it's difficult to simply close this story and move on as if it were just another chapter of the past. Because what happened to the Nazi scientists didn't end when they were absorbed, hidden, judged, or forgotten. What truly remains is the trail of the decisions made at that time. Cold, strategic decisions, often justified as necessary, but which continue to echo silently to this day. Perhaps you've never stopped to think about it this way, and that's normal. Most people learn history in well-defined blocks: war, defeat, trials, reconstruction. Everything seems organized, almost clean. But when you look closer, you realize that between these blocks there are enormous gray areas, spaces where difficult choices were made without anyone asking for an opinion, without anyone being informed, without any real consensus on what was right or wrong. What's most unsettling is understanding that there wasn't an official moment when anyone said, "This was a mistake." There was no public apology. There was no complete review of these agreements. Everything was left behind, buried in files, diluted by time, normalized by the narrative of progress. And little by little, the idea that it was necessary came to be accepted almost without question. When you look at the current world, at the accelerated technological advancement, at disputes between powers, at the race for artificial intelligence, weaponry, and strategic dominance, it's impossible not to see parallels. The logic is frighteningly similar. Whoever possesses valuable knowledge gains negotiating leverage. Whoever is useful becomes tolerable, and ethical issues, once again, risk becoming an inconvenient obstacle. This story also raises a point that bothers many people: selective memory. Remembering only what is convenient is a form of collective protection. But it is also a form of distortion. When certain facts are left out of the official narrative, it creates the illusion that we have learned everything we needed to learn, when, in reality, perhaps we have only learned to hide things better. And this isn't about rewriting history or pointing fingers decades later. It's about understanding patterns, about recognizing how decisions are made when there is fear, urgency, and a struggle for power. Because these conditions don't belong only to the past. They repeat themselves, always with new justifications, new discourses, and new technologies involved. What makes all this even more disturbing is realizing that if these choices hadn't been questioned by historians, journalists, and researchers over the years, much would have remained invisible. Silence would have prevailed, and this shows how history is not something fixed, closed, or definitive. It depends on who asks, who investigates, and who refuses to accept overly simplistic answers. Ultimately, perhaps the greatest impact of this story is personal, because, after understanding what happened, it becomes difficult to look at any official narrative without a healthy dose of skepticism. It becomes difficult not to wonder what was left out, what was softened, what was postponed for later. And this unease is not a bad thing. On the contrary, it's a sign that you're seeing beyond the surface. And that's precisely why this story doesn't end here, because everything that was done with these scientists stemmed from a series of silent decisions, beginning way back in the first days after the German defeat. Decisions that seemed small, technical, provisional, but that ended up shaping the world in ways that only now are we beginning to understand clearly. And now I want to know from you, how did this story make you feel? At what point did you realize that the official version didn't tell the whole story? Leave that in the comments, because your reading is also part of this conversation. If this content helped you see the story in a new light, your like strengthens the channel and helps this type of investigation reach more people. By subscribing, you continue to follow real, profound, and little-known stories like this one, which don't appear in books but help us understand today's world.